In this video, we're going to look at the transaction page and also on how to inspect account states and cycle through the history of those account states and link them back to transactions that are responsible for changing those states. First, let's launch the Luzid as usual. We launch it over here in the terminal and we go to our UI. And when you first start the UI, you basically are greeted with this screen in the transactions page because you don't have any transactions yet, and it's basically trying to help you and tell you, look, maybe you should create some. And it leads you to this sample app, tic-tac-toe. And if you just launch the first transaction here, if you just press Fund Player, we get the first transactions in our Luzid view, and you could see that that happens super fast. And let's look at that in a little bit detail. So here we basically have a list of transactions that are coming in real time. And on the left here, we have the slot in which the transaction was executed. Then in the middle, we have either the label and the signature if the transaction is labeled, or maybe just the signature if it's not. And over here, we have some numbers regarding the accounts that were involved in this transaction, namely the total of accounts, then how many signers, how many were writable, and how many were read-only. And now before we continue, we need to think of something. So this is a tic-tac-toe app, right, which requires the tic-tac-toe program to actually be loaded in the validator to be able to work, right? But our validator doesn't have that program loaded yet. It just started, right? And still, when we run this transaction here, create game, we can see that it creates a game, and it took a while to do that. And the reason is because Luzid realized, okay, you're trying to create a game, you're trying to execute this transaction on this program, but I don't have this program in my validator, right? And by default, we tell Luzid that the remote is DevNet. So it says, okay, let me look on DevNet if maybe that program exists on DevNet. And at the same time, it's going to look for the executable data of that program as well as the IDL if it can find it. And then in this transaction here, we can see that it cloned all these accounts into our validator, and then in the next instruction we can then actually run the program. We can basically create the game as if we would have already had that program. You can see that this is the program that just got cloned into our validator. So that makes it possible for you to just get going. You don't have to worry about what programs you're going to need, right? You just start working, and anything that is missing will automatically be added to the validator. And obviously you could then, and we'll show that in later videos, still have these programs also available locally if you want to basically clone them from there. Now let's play a little more, and in order to do that more effectively, we're going to put Luzid on top. So we have this feature here where we can say always enable on top, right? I selected the view menu. And the same I can do by pressing Control Space. And now I can just play the game. Let me just go through, and we can see transactions coming in real time super fast, right? And we can cycle through these transactions. Either we can select them, right? And then the update over here, or we can use the arrow keys, just go through them. Or obviously, if you're a Vim user like me, you will like that we can also use JK to cycle through the transactions. And for each of these transactions, we can have more information available. One is like we can open logs, either we can click on this, right? And we're going to have another video explaining these logs, but they're pretty much like the logs in the Solana Explorer, except that the CPI is visualized more clearly. Or we can also just press O, has the same effect. And we can also open this transaction in the Explorer over here. So let me show that, and that's also available if you just press E, has the same effect. Now let's focus a little bit on the right side over here, which are the details of the accounts. For instance, in this transaction here that we just looked at, create game, if you click on this account here, we can see that it shows us the diff of the account as it was before the transaction ran and then after. And in this case, the balance changed. It changed from 1 sol to a little less than 1 sol because it actually had to fund creating that game. Now, if the account actually had data changes, it shows something different, right? In this case, for instance, here, nothing really changed about the game account. The data size stayed the same, but the data itself changed, and that's why the inspect account data button is here, which we're going to look at in a second. But first I wanted to show that you can also do the same thing I just did with the keyboard. You can also do that with keyboard shortcuts. So if I, for instance, want to select the second account from the top here, game, I can just press 2. And if I want the first one, I can press 1. And those are just like some quick, so you can actually cycle through here, quickly select what we want, and keep going. And now let's use that keyboard shortcut to select the game, and then we can just press space, because you can see that the inspect account data is already pre-selected, right? When we open this, it's already selected, and we can just press space to jump to an inspect view. Now that inspect view is very interesting because it basically shows us the account state over time. So we are looking at it from the perspective of the account. So when we look at transactions, right, we look at, okay, what happened over time, like what transactions we're running. Here we're focusing on a specific account, and we can see how it changed over time. So in this case, for instance, we're looking at the last transactions that the account was involved in. And we can see that two things changed. The turn went from 3 to 4, and then the board, we added an X on the game board. And down here we have the full JSON of that same state. We can see that basically before there was a null here, for instance, and now there's an X. And then we can use these buttons down here to cycle through the history of the account state, which is really useful. We can also do that with shortcuts, either with the arrow keys left, right, or with H and L. If you want to jump to the beginning, we can use either J and K or up and down buttons. Now that's pretty nice, and it basically allows us to understand more about what happened to the account over time, and also which transactions actually are responsible. So for instance, if I go to this one here and I want to understand what caused this change, we have the transaction over here, and we can easily navigate to this instruction by clicking this one here, this button, or we can just press N. So I'm going to press the letter N, and then we jump exactly to that instruction here that caused that change in the account. We can jump back. If I jump, for instance, to the beginning, we want to know which transaction actually created this account, and press N, then the create game transaction is pre-selected. Other things we have is we can quickly see the logs of that particular transaction, right? That created that account or changed that account state. And we can also, as before, we can navigate in the Explorer to that transaction, right? We can look over here, or, and let me actually just show that better, so we can see that particular transaction. Or we can also, in this case, it makes sense to also want to see the account in the Explorer itself, right? The account that we're looking at here. We can press here, or we can press Shift E, and now we basically have that account here in the Explorer. We can see the transaction history, and we can also see the anchor data of the current state of the account, versus here with Luzid, we can obviously see the different states over time. Now, another nice feature that might be useful is we can actually switch this to play, and which will now watch the account state as we change it. So we can make some changes here, and you can see that it keeps fetching the updated state here, and we can just keep going there. And when we then press a button here, we are back into the mode where we can look through the history. Another thing that I want to show before finishing this video is that you can also look at the account data in raw format. And that is basically the default if an IDL is not available. And we can obviously also just go through that and look at the diff in kind of the raw format. However, if the IDL is available, you probably want to look at the data in a parsed manner because it makes it easier to understand. And finally, we can close the inspect view when we're done with it. And that concludes this video. And in the next one, we will look at the accounts view in detail, which allows us to take snapshots